Hi everyone, today I'm going to expand upon our lectures from last week and specifically look at how facts are constructed in text and talk, how people build their accounts in actual discourse to make them appear solid and real. And we'll look at the particular devices that are used in everyday discourse and ordinary talk by which this is achieved. Central to discursive psychology is how descriptions are put together to appear factual or objective, as reflecting the real nature of events rather than an interested version. And Potter refers to this as the out there-ness of a description or account. And of course, the dilemma of stake or interest is a pervasive concern for participants, and people attend to this in their talk, producing accounts that are represented as independent of their own interests, their own motives and desires. And the latter, of course, are always contestable or challengeable. So in everyday life and conversation, we present our versions and accounts of what is going on in our lives, who we are, and the nature of our relationships, etc. So speakers draw on a range of discursive devices and strategies to construct factuality and manage the dilemma of stake or interest in their talk. Alexa Hepburn refers to the Reality Production Toolkit, which is a list of devices and strategies that are typically and commonly used in everyday talk and conversation. So I want to look at some of these, not all, because the list is quite long in today's lecture, and to teach you how to be able to identify and spot these devices when you're analysing a piece of text or a piece of conversation. The first of these is referred to as category entitlement, and that is when speakers warrant the validity of their view or account or version of an event by emphasising their membership or that of others to a particular category, which entitles them to know and to speak authoritatively about certain things. Now, of course, in scientific report writing, we do this all the time when we use references, when we cite references to support and warrant particular claims that we're making as being factual, objective, neutral, as being supported by the scientific literature. But people do this in everyday talk as well, and it doesn't necessarily have to follow the example that I've got here on the slide, which is often used where professional authorities are cited as warranting a particular view, but also memberships to ordinary categories such as mother or father or child or adult that could be used to lay claims to the entitlement of power or authority over a particular view or account. So, a mother may say to a child, I'm your parent, I'm your mother, and I know what's best for you. And that's a typical ordinary use of category entitlement that's used in sort of everyday social interaction, and of course is often used as a way of disciplining children or teaching children particular normative standards of behaviour. The tool is referred to as stake inoculation, and this is when speakers can construct their talk as coming from someone whose stake in that talk is counter to what you would expect. So something along the lines of, my partner and I have been in a same-sex relationship for over 10 years, but we will be voting no to same-sex marriage. So this is counter to what you would expect. This is an opinion or view that would be counter to what you would expect from, say, a same-sex couple, and would thus give it sort of extra kind of weight and power in terms of their opposition to same-sex marriage and, you know, their reasons for voting against same-sex marriage. It gives it a kind of an authoritative appeal. In a previous lecture, we looked at consensus and the use of consensus warrants in the talk of particular speakers, in particular Jade Goody's denials of racism. But corroboration and consensus is another powerful way in which people can construct their descriptions or accounts as something upon which everyone agrees, or something that's corroborated by sort of independent witnesses. So, you know, you might be describing an event that occurred at a party, you know, the behaviour of someone at a party that you were at, and you might say his behaviour intimidated everyone who was there. So not just me who was intimidated, but everyone, so that, you know, it's not just an interested version, it's not just your paranoia, for example, but everyone's appraisal and evaluation of this person's behaviour was the same. And, you know, various claims that people might make in everyday life. Oh, everyone knows that Australians are happy-go-lucky or easygoing. Oh, everyone knows that men and women are different, for example. Voicing is another device, and it's very commonly used when we're providing accounts, particularly of, you know, something that happened or a conversation that took place, and you're reporting it to somebody else. When we use reported speech, what we're doing is presenting views and impressions as a reliable and accurate record of what actually took place. It's almost like, you know, having switched on the tape recorder and playing it back to the listener. So, you know, when you're reporting on a conversation that you might have had with someone, you might say something like, you know, Mary then turned to me and said, "Why have you been avoiding me?" And then I said, "I haven't, I've just been real busy." So this is active voicing. Sometimes it's referred to as reported speech, where people actively voice the contents of a conversation or a piece of social interaction in order to bring it to life to the listener. And in this way, sort of presents it as almost an audio recording, an accurate reflection of a conversation that actually took place. The use of vivid description is another interesting tool, and this is where rich and vivid detail, careful observation, and noticing can enhance the reliability of an account, event, or description. And you'll often see this used by witnesses in legal trials when their memory of a particular event might be challenged, say, by the prosecution, and they will provide, you know, rich, vivid details in order to sort of authenticate and substantiate the reliability of what it was that they witnessed, of what they had seen. So the following example gives you a sense of what this might look like. That morning was especially wet and windy, and the traffic lights were working intermittently. When I passed by my neighbour's house, I noticed that his newspaper was still on the front lawn. So there's certain things we can say about this account. The noticing of the weather, the description of the weather, remembering it being wet and windy, that the traffic lights were working intermittently. You know, these all add to the vividness and out there-ness and objectiveness of the account. Noticing that the newspaper hadn't been collected on the front lawn. All these work up the reliability of the account that the speaker is providing. At the same time, systematic vagueness can also work in the same way when people provide accounts and descriptions which are vague, and there's a lack of detail and a lack of particular features. This actually draws attention away from one's own stake and interest in the account. So it's quite interesting the way in which both providing vivid detail and being systematically vague can work the same way rhetorically. You often sort of see this being used in political discourse, for example, where politicians, when they're asked to provide explanations or reasons for certain things, will not actually provide a lot of detail, but provide quite vague responses. And this is sort of a way again of not being able to be challenged. If you provide a lot of detail, if you provide facts and figures, well, these can be contested, these can be challenged. People can do fact checks, for example. I notice now the ABC does it all the time on Q&A. But if people are just systematically vague and say, oh, well, there are many reasons for poverty and economic hardship, but at the end of the day, the poor need to help themselves. Well, this doesn't really say anything, does it? And it doesn't really stand up to, a very specific, direct and concrete challenge. Some more examples include the following, and we'll see how these are used in some specific examples in a moment. Maximising claims, we saw some examples of that in the previous lecture. These are referred to as extreme case formulations, or ECFs for short. The use of lists, when people list off various reasons or a list of things, often this sort of demonstrates the comprehensiveness of their claims. And these are very common in political discourse. A very common one that was used, I think, by the sitting coalition government in the last election was, our party stands for jobs, jobs and jobs, even though, there isn't really anything more than just jobs. The fact that it was emphasised and repeated 3 times. Repetition, of course, is also a rhetorical device, and that's, of course, often used very commonly in political discourse. But we'll see how 3-part lists are typically used in ordinary conversation in a minute, not just in political discourse. And the use of contrast structures, when people compare 2 things. This is another persuasive kind of rhetorical device that's used in everyday talk. So here's an example from a focus group discussion that we did in some research some time ago. We asked university students to talk about Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in Australia, and this came out of an honours project with one of my students, Lucinda Sale. And you'll see some of the use of these sorts of rhetorical devices here in this particular example. And in this focus group, they were asked to discuss why it was that they thought Indigenous Australians were so disadvantaged in 21st century Australia. Why were they living in such poor conditions compared to the rest of Australians? Now here's a response from one of the participants, participant A. I think too, and also when you look at history, you look back at the fact that the Aborigines were very, very primitive, and they confronted our culture that was superior, I'm not sure that's a word, superiorly more advanced. The wheel had been advanced and whatnot, but the Aborigines hadn't seemed to advance past that very primitive stage and whatnot. They had sort of had no modern technologies as such as the British had. Like the British had gunpowder and alcohol, and these things are. And I think that was another big problem. So we can see a few things here. We can see the use of extreme case formulations. Indigenous Australians are represented, constructed as very, very primitive, not just primitive, but very, very primitive. European culture, or our culture as it's referred to, presumably it stands for non-Indigenous culture or European culture, is described as more advanced, as superior, again, a sort of an extreme case formulation. Note the way in which two cultures are contrasted, and this is what we mean when we talk about contrast structures. Indigenous culture is contrasted with non-Indigenous culture, in particular European culture, and we'll see that they later on he specifically refers to the British, so we can assume British culture here, if not European. And down the bottom you can see the use of a three-part list where A describes that the British had gunpowder, alcohol, and these things. Now, notice that these things is sort of is a vague kind of list completer, but it is typically used in lists where people might say etc. or whatnot, or a whole string of things, and then sort of conclude with a very generalized list completer. And we see that sort of being worked up here in this particular account. Okay, so they were just a few examples of the sorts of things that we might notice when we're analysing discourse, the sorts of things we can examine when we're analysing text and talk. But what I want to move on now is to contrast discursive psychology and traditional attitude research, or how attitudes are studied in social psychology in particular, because discursive psychology offers a very radical re-specification of the traditional attitude construct. Unlike in traditional psychology, attitudes are not viewed as stable and enduring cognitive structures, but are viewed more as evaluative practices which have, again, practical consequences for participants in everyday social interaction. And what I mean by that, in terms of having practical consequences, is that these evaluations are always oriented to action. What it is that people are doing with their talk. Are they explaining? Are they defending? Are they justifying? Are they rationalizing? Are they presenting a particular identity for themselves and others? What this means in practice, when you actually analyse people's talk and everyday conversation, is that their evaluative practices are fragmentary, they're inconsistent and contradictory. Everyday talk is messy, and of course that's really difficult to quantify by the use of quantitative techniques, and that's what a lot of traditional social psychology does. It uses aggregating quantitative methods, and this approach to the use of quantitative data, whereby people, pick strongly agree as opposed to strongly disagree, and mark a particular box, and their responses are categorized in this all or none way, is that it suppresses this variability, and we don't get to see the messiness in people's practices of evaluation, how people actually do evaluations in everyday life. Now, to give you an example of this messiness and the textual, contextual variability and inconsistency and contradiction, let's go back to the example that I gave before, the account that A gave about the current plight of Indigenous people. And this was a common theme that people returned to in the focus groups. And one of the issues that kept coming up again was history, and we saw how A, in his explanatory account, actually talked about history. In fact, he says, when you look at history, and this is a nice sort of factual device, in the sense that, he's saying, well, let's look at the historical record, and that in itself kind of solidifies or tries to solidify the claims that he's making. It's not just him saying this, you know, it's proven by the historical record. So here he is really providing a particular account around history, and we can surmise from this that in his view in particular, in order to explain Indigenous disadvantage, you've got to look at history. History is important. And indeed, he is emphasising here the importance of history in understanding the current plight of Indigenous Australians. Now contrast this previous account with what A says later on when the discussion moves to Indigenous native title claims. So the context varies. You know, they're now moving away from talking about economic disadvantage to the entitlements of Indigenous people to land. And he says the following: "But I think arguing over things that happened in the past is just ridiculous. It doesn't get you anywhere." They sort of say that they keep bringing up the point that they were here sort of in Australia before the British and whatnot, and that it was the British background that did all this, and they seem to be taking out generation after generation. Until people sort of let go of the past and say, well, we can't do anything about that, let's just try and get something done in the future, it's just always going to be bickering. And indeed, one of the other people in the focus groups, Jay, interrupting, says it's not constructive. So whereas in the previous account, A is arguing for the importance of history in order to explain issues around Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, here he's arguing that basically bringing up history over and over again is not constructive. It's actually preventing us from moving forward and moving forward to you know, a rosier kind of future. So traditional social psychology might have some trouble accounting for this contradiction over the importance of history, let's say. But this kind of variability, discursive psychology argues, is indicative of rhetorical orientation and function. Evaluations are rhetorically organised to perform social actions, such as explaining, blaming, excusing, justifying. And of course, these social actions are likely to change depending on what it is that people are trying to do, you know, with their talk. So text and talk are viewed as social practices that function to constitute particular versions or constructions of reality, not cognitive entities, or attitudes are not viewed as cognitive entities, but as social practices that do things in particular contexts and are always oriented to social action and also to function. Okay, so we've just contrasted discursive psychology, its approach to the study of attitudes, with traditional social psychological approaches. Let's do the same with categorisation, or social categorisation in particular. Now, within social psychology and cognitive science and philosophy and linguistics, social categorisation is assumed to be a very pervasive cognitive tendency. And various functions have been put forward to account for why this is a very ubiquitous phenomenon. And one of them is that it simplifies an overly complex world. This is the kind of social cognition approach, that by categorising, we're simplifying the sort of amount of sensory input that we are processing at any particular point in time. Other approaches, more social approaches, argue that, well, what social categorisation does is it renders the world more intelligible. It renders the social world more understandable by being able to attach and associate group identities with particular individuals. Now, discursive psychology introduces yet another perspective on the study of categorization, a non-cognitive perspective, because all of the approaches in social psychology have a cognitive sort of underbelly to it, if you like. So discursive psychology challenges the view that social categories are rigid, a priori cognitive structures. They're not treated as cognitive phenomena located in people's heads, as sort of, preformed static structures organised around prototypical representations of the category. This is the very typical social cognition, cognitive science model of categorisation. Rather, discursive psychology emphasises that people constitute categories, actually construct categories discursively in order to do certain things. People are actively constructing the boundaries of the category in their talk. They don't necessarily pre-exist in a static format cognitively as mental structures in the head. And this is what Potter and Weatherall said in 1987 in their landmark textbook, Discourse and Social Psychology. Instead of seeing categorisation as a natural phenomenon, something which just happens automatically, it is regarded as a complex and subtle social accomplishment. This emphasises the action orientation of categorisation in discourse. It asks how categories are flexibly articulated in the course of certain sorts of talk and writing to accomplish particular goals, such as blamings or justifications. In a similar vein, Derek Edwards argues that categories are for talking. That's what categories do. They function in talk in order for people to get things done. Categorisation, he says, is something we do in talk in order to accomplish social actions, persuasions, blamings, denial, refutations, accusations, etc. And he argues indeed that some category constructions that are banal in their kind of everyday common use, like male, female, girl, boy, young, old, adult, child, they're so familiar, they're so pervasive that they give an effect of realism or fact. So we might in accounts say, oh, this girl I knew, or this girl the other night, and no one may challenge that description, and yet there are various other ways perhaps in which we may have described this person. There are many other categories we could have used to reference that person in our account, and the selection of the category girl may actually perform some very delicate rhetorical work when we provide our account or description. So he argues that people therefore come to regard category constructions not as versions of reality, but as direct representations of reality itself. So by describing the person as a girl, I'm giving it a kind of basis in fact, whereas in actuality, if I had described her as a young woman or a friend, or a vivacious partygoer, various different kinds of versions of the account or event would have been constructed. So discursive psychology is interested in how categories become constructed in different social contexts and how this method of construction creates a subjectivity for oneself and for others. So it's not simply a cognitive internal process based on direct and veridical perception. sensory input that comes through the eyes, if you like, but a discursive practice which is actively constructed in discourse for rhetorical ends. As such, social categories are expected to be variable, flexible, and shifting depending on their functional and contextual uses. So discursive psychology examines and analyses how categories are used in specific instances and what interactional or rhetorical work they perform in being used in this way in this particular instance. Categories are viewed as discursive resources that are used in talk, again, to perform social actions. And categorisation is treated as a kind of social practice rather than a cognitive process. So a very concrete example, if you like, and a more kind of politicised, contentious one, not so banal, is how we refer to people seeking asylum. And there are various alternative categories and categorisations that have been used over the last 20 years for particular rhetorical purposes. They've been described as boat people, they've been described as asylum seekers, they've been described as refugees, they've been described as illegal immigrants, illegals, queue jumpers, so on. And we can see that the kind of category that's used in a particular instance constructs a very different version, an account of the group and its moral entitlements and our obligations to them. Now, this approach to categorisation has been influenced by Harvey Sachs' work in ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, which examined how categories are used in naturally occurring conversation and social interaction. Now, in the laboratory, social categories are used unproblematically as verbal stimuli in experimental procedures that are designed to elicit either implicit or explicit evaluative responses. So often, you'll get, a verbal stimulus presented to you with the actual category name, and people then respond to it. And it's often been assumed in a lot of cognitive science research that, that these are neutral descriptors. These category descriptors are just neutral reflections of the group. Categories such as black, white, male, female, Christian, Muslim. But actually, these categories in and of themselves carry a lot of symbolic, moral, and evaluative weight. So let's have a look at an example here. This is a YouTube video of former Prime Minister Gordon Brown when he was overheard describing a constituent, a woman that he was talking to, as a bigoted woman. Now, watch the video and have a look at what transpired. So when Gordon Brown was asked by his aide, what did she say, he provides no details, sort of, we can call this a form of systematic vagueness. But what he does do is to categorise her as just a bigoted woman. Now, we don't need to know what Mrs. Duffy actually said to infer the kinds of things a bigoted person might say about immigration. And I have to add that that's, one of the things that's not shown in the video, that she was previously talking about all the, immigrants that were coming to the UK. She was complaining about them taking British jobs away. So this categorisation of Mrs. Duffy as a bigoted person provides a rich source of common sense knowledge about, what a bigoted person is likely to have said. It holds considerable moral weight. Having bigoted views is generally deemed, socially unacceptable, at least, for Mr. Brown and his aide. So categorising her in this way not only depicts Mrs. Duffy negatively, but also holds her accountable for such views. And we'll see how Mrs. Duffy responds to this description of herself, this identity construction, in the next slide. So Mrs. Duffy retorts with, why has he come out with words like that? He's going to leave this country and he's calling an ordinary woman who's just come up and asked him questions that most people would ask him. So you can see here how she uses an alternative identity ascription or category to describe herself, just an ordinary woman, and we can remember who else described themselves as an ordinary Australian, and what kind of moral weight or rhetorical work this kind of category of ordinary carries to describe yourself. Oh, I'm just an ordinary Australian, or I'm just an ordinary person. And basically, the consensus warrant, she asked him questions that most people would ask him. So it was nothing kind of about her. She had no particular stake in interest in being categorised in this way and asking questions about, immigration, because they're questions that normatively most people would want to have answered. So this alternative category works as a clear contrast to the category bigoted and normalises Mrs. Duffy and what she has to say about immigration. And as I said, at the end of the extract, she characterises the questions she asks the Prime Minister as questions that most people would ask, a form of a consensus warrant. So discursive psychology examines these categories in talk primarily in terms of what sorts of interactional things they do as participants' resources for doing descriptions and explanations, rather than analysts' explanatory resources. Now, what do we mean by this? What we mean is that the point of discursive psychology is not to diagnose Mrs. Duffy, whether she really is bigoted, whether she's high on prejudice or racism, or whether this is actually a racist statement, in the same way that the example that I gave of Jade Goody was not really to demonstrate or diagnose Jade Goody as a racist or not, because discursive psychology doesn't subscribe to that kind of epistemology that is central to social psychology, or to psychology in general, actually. What it does is to look at how people work up identities or deny certain kinds of identities in talk, in everyday life, as a way of leading their lives. It's not about pigeonholing people as certain types of people, but as people who use language in order to get things done and to move their way through everyday life.